Hello and welcome to episode 23 of Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, the podcast where we're going through every one of the so-called Disney animated classics in chronological order and reviewing them on their own merits. Afterwards, we decide whether they're worthy of going on our own refined list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. My name is Ben, and joining me as always is my good friend Liam. Liam, what film are we looking at this week?
This week, Ben, we are taking a look at 1986's The Great Mouse Detective, based on the Basil of Baker Street books by Eve Titus. I've mentioned in previous podcasts of a series of 5 VHSs that I had and just watched to death as a child, and this is definitely one of those 5, so I'm really familiar with this film. Going into this, what's your background with this film?
I genuinely don't think I saw this film until I was in my 20s. We were talking about it at university and I was like, this sounds great. So I bought it on DVD and we watched it.
Was that the first time you watched it then?
I think it was, yeah. I mean, I had very vague recollections, so maybe I'd seen bits of it when I was very, very young, but certainly the first time I'd properly sat down and watched it.
So let's jump right in then. I've got to say, from the start, I love the animated version of gritty Victorian London.
Yeah, it really feels like this is a gritty crime drama. I think everything's always at night and there's this smog. Comparing it to The Black Cauldron, which we looked at last time, even though it's dark, there's still really good contrast and things look very smooth. I think the colouring in this and the backgrounds and the integration of animation into those things works really well and might be the best example of that we've seen, certainly in this era of Disney.
That's something that really stands out right from the beginning, is that this is a really well animated film. We're back on track. This is up there with the classics as looking great.
And I think it's really the first of these films that looks like a modern Disney film. Obviously, when I say modern, I'm not including the actual modern CGI films, but the ones we get in the late 80s, the 90s, the early noughties, I think this is the first one that actually looks like it fits into that animation style and quality.
Which is really weird because the next one certainly doesn't.
Yeah, and I suppose this is where we start to get this divergence of having 2 separate teams working on 2 separate films at once in the animation studios. Again, as we mentioned in Black Cauldron, Ron Clements and John Musker basically walked off that to work on Basil instead. Then they went on after this to work on The Little Mermaid, and a lot of the team from the Black Cauldron working on Oliver and Company. So that's why there's this alternating quality and style in the 80s, and to a certain degree in the 90s, because you've got this alternating structure of 2 teams working on films.
I do think it's really interesting that you can see, even at this point, the importance of a strong lead team. Again, Musker and Clements going on to make some absolutely fantastic films. Even to this day, they're still churning them out with Disney, and they're consistently good. Maybe a couple of dips, but we'll get to those. So it's nice to see that even during this dark age of Disney, they were able to produce something of the quality that we would later come to expect of them.
And speaking of dark age of Disney, I think tonally this film is certainly a dark film. We open, as we say, on a misty night in Victorian London, and there is a toy maker making toys, as is his wont, for his daughter, and they hear someone knocking at the door.
Immediately, there are a few things that strike me about this introduction. First off, we open on human London and slowly zoom in to a mouse toy shop. And it's a fairly ornate door, and I'm wondering how many people are aware of the mouse toy shop.
It's a good question. I was thinking the same much later when we cut to Buckingham Palace, and I was like, surely someone's getting fired for all the mice that are in Buckingham Palace.
So right out of the gate, this film raises a question that I never really feel is resolved by the end of the film, which is how aware of mouse society are humans? And are the mice aware that they perfectly parallel human society? Is it intentional or is it entirely accidental?
It's a really good question. And at first I was thinking, well, it's similar to The Rescuers, but no, because in The Rescuers, it's all human-sized stuff that they've repurposed. The cabin on the Albatross that they sit in is a little sardine can that they kind of wind back up to sit in. Or as a lectern, they use a cotton reel. Whereas in this, they just have pubs and armchairs and guns, no problem.
And it's not just the scaling, though I've got some major problems with the scaling in this film. It's the fact that there seems to be a one-to-one correspondence for every person in the real world, there is a one-to-one mouse correspondent. Again, we mentioned the Queen, and the Mouse Queen is having her Diamond Jubilee, which I'm like, how? How is that possible? It's a mouse.
You see, and at first I think they do a good job of getting around it, because basically you see Basil the Mouse, detective, lives at 221B Baker Street, as does Sherlock Holmes. So the implication is that he's copied Sherlock Holmes's approaches and his mannerisms, and that's why he's ended up the way he is. But that doesn't explain why Dawson is exactly the same as Dr. Watson, and has also been serving in Afghanistan, which they specifically say. So either there's a separate mouse-based conflict between Britain and Afghanistan, or he's over there because the humans are there and he's helping them, or when human Britain went to war in Afghanistan, the Mouse Kingdom had to go, well, I know we're good friends, but I guess we're at war now because that's what's going on in the human world.
You've touched on the linchpin that makes it all fall apart for me, which is Dawson, because Dawson just happens upon Basil. But despite that, he's been serving in an Afghan war. He's just returned as a surgeon. And I'm happy for Basil to be emulating Sherlock Holmes, but that is the strangest coincidence.
And you could say, oh, well, maybe Dawson was travelling with Dr. Watson, but we established that Dr. Watson already knows Holmes, and Dawson doesn't know Basil, so... it just blows my mind. Also, how does a mouse live for 60 years if it's a Diamond Jubilee? Do they have to keep churning them out and go, oh, well, another one's died, we need another Queen Mouse Toria?
Yeah, maybe it is like the class hamster situation. Basically, mouse society is constantly trying to keep up with human society, which is an incredibly difficult ask because they're mice. The Rescuers is like a parallel secret world, and I love secret worlds. I think they're a really good narrative jumping off point. But an exact mirror, it just raises too many questions. But we have our introduction. We go into this toy shop. We meet Scrooge McDuck and his daughter.
By which we mean we've got Alan Young voicing the toy maker. Alan Young also voiced Scrooge McDuck with a questionable Scottish accent.
I'll make this point now. Suzanne Platschek, the voice of Olivia, the little girl, her acting is fine. As far as child voice actors go, she's all right, and she's in the film enough that it would be a problem if it was any worse. But despite the fact that she's actually Scottish, her accent doesn't sound right at all.
Look, can you just sound more Scottish? But I am Scottish. No, it's just, it's not good.
But we interrupt this happy scene by the introduction of our old favourite Candy Candido shows up as this really horrifying bat called Fidget who comes and kidnaps Flaversham.
I think you're really underselling he comes and kidnaps Flaversham. We get a creepy banging on the door, Flaversham hides his daughter, and then we get a full-on crash zoom shot fill of a wild-eyed Fidget screaming into the frame. It's a full-on jump scare.
It's a really good scene. One thing I really like in this scene is we don't actually see the scuffle. We see Olivia watching the scuffle from the cupboard and you just see their shadows on it. And I think that's a really nice way of Disney introducing a bit of threat and violence without it being graphic and without necessarily going towards that higher rating.
And also focusing on character reactions. Olivia is the emotional drive of this film in a lot of ways. So yeah, I think it's important that we establish her as a character. Admittedly, a character's not very well rounded, but still, it's important.
So yeah, it's a really strong opening, and we see the aftermath. Olivia comes out of the cupboard, and the whole shop is dark and ruined, and the image of the furniture everywhere with paint dripping down is just burnt into the deepest recesses of my brain.
Yeah, I think it is really striking. You've got this little girl, I think she's meant to be 8 years old, and her father's gone, and she's completely alone in this terrifying Victorian London, and it's just her shouting and asking for her daddy whilst crying. And then we get the upbeat theme music to the film, doing a jackknife turn on the tone. Bum 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 bum.
The score is absolutely fantastic, produced by Henry Mancini. and you can tell there's a lot of his similar work in it. One thing I find really interesting is whenever a musician associated with a particular instrument creates a score, obviously that instrument features very, very heavily. So there's a lot of flute and wind in this score, and I think it works really well.
You mean woodwind instruments, don't you?
No, just the sound of wind.
Henry Mancini, for those of you who don't know, did a lot of famous Hollywood music, including writing Moon River, the Audrey Hepburn song. So there you go.
I was associating with the Pink Panther theme, which I'm hearing a lot of that, really, that influence and that approach in the score for Basil. It's an excellent score. If you've not seen the film, I think watching it just for the score should be enough. There's a lot more to the film, obviously. So we've got a big bombastic theme tune. We've got a little bit of front credits, including the cast. One notable thing that stood out was that top billing above everyone else was Vincent Price as Ratigan.
Liam, I'm very excited to talk about Ratigan, and I promise as soon as we get to him in the plot, we will talk about him.
For now, let's just say he absolutely earns his place as top billing in this film. But we cut to Dawson having just arrived from Afghanistan. He would have died. I don't think a mouse would survive the length of the journey from Afghanistan to England at the time.
It's so weird. And I swear he's travelling on a human coach.
In order to get into the coach, there's a little step, I suppose would be the word. And he's just riding on that. I'm surprised they didn't go the whole hog and have a little carriage suspended underneath the actual carriage. The scaling is a nightmare. Again, in The Rescuers, there were those times when they were like, okay, what would this look like in a mouse's world? And here they were just like, it's like People World, but smaller. So Dawson arrives, he sees Olivia and sees that she's looking for Basil of Baker Street, and he says, I don't know any Basil, but I do know Baker Street. And so he takes her where they meet the great mouse detective himself, Basil.
I can't be the only person who, whenever someone says Baker Street, they hear the sax solo from Baker Street.
I don't want to say it's an unfortunate association, because it's obviously a great bit of music, but it is, as a result, unfortunately tied to Sherlock Holmes forever.
So on arrival, Basil's not initially there, but then he barges in a crazy costume and introduces himself. And he's doing the standard Sherlock Holmes thing of immediately deducing who people are, what their background is, why they're there, ruining his flat, and kind of being a bit of an arsehole, whilst also being very clever.
I have several questions about this scene. First of all, I believe Basil would have deduced that Olivia didn't have a mother.
Yeah, so he's not very happy that Olivia's there, and he starts trying to get rid of her. And he says, why don't you go to your parents? And she says, oh, well, my daddy's been kidnapped and I don't have a mother. And he gets a bit awkward. And I think you're right, but I suppose I interpret it as it's made very clear he doesn't have any time for children at all. So I interpret it as he couldn't even be bothered to do something he can basically do subconsciously because he's an arsehole.
My other question is, where did they get feathers that size to stuff the pillows with? Because Basil shoots several pillows and they explode into a flurry of feathers. But it would be as if I shot a pillow and feathers went everywhere. But these are mice, so the feathers are tiny. I'm just going to say, there are going to be several points in this film where the scale really takes me out of it. This is just the first of many.
I mean, I could accept the feathers thing. It didn't really jar with me. What did is much later on when there's just a pub out in the open that's for mice and bats. That messed with my mind a lot more, I suppose.
Also, was Basil's racist costume somehow based on Rodney Dangerfield?
You mean the mad, bulging eyes, presumably?
The design of the mouse looks just like the dog Rover Dangerfield, who is supposed to be an animated dog interpretation of Rodney Dangerfield.
This is the second time you've brought up Rover Dangerfield in this podcast, and I'm furious about it.
It's constantly there in the back of my mind.
I don't think we've mentioned Moana once, but Rover Dangerfield.
Also, those aren't crumpets, those are muffins.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Irritates me every time.
So, as Liam mentioned, Basil fires a bullet from a gun and he checks the casing to see if it's got the right markings, but unfortunately it's not quite right and he's at another dead end and he's not going to find the person he's looking for. But when Olivia starts explaining that her dad has been kidnapped by a bat with a wooden leg, Basil realises it's a henchman of none other than Professor Rattigan, the very criminal he's trying to track down.
A criminal whose quite fancy portrait he keeps above his fireplace.
I'd written exactly the same thing. He's like, I hate him so much. This is why I've got a lovingly crafted portrait of him on pride of place above my mantelpiece. And this is in 1897 when they didn't have colour photography, which means he commissioned that from an artist.
This just gives credence to possibly one of my favourite fan theories. A lot of people out there are insistent that Basil and Rattigan are exes.
I'd go so far as to say there's literally no evidence for that.
Other than people like doing it with Holmes and Moriarty, I suppose.
I do know, not from direct exposure, thank God, that a lot of people ship Rattigan with basically every other Disney character for reasons I don't fully understand.
Before we move on, you mentioned the ballistics test, and they do this really nice effect where it seems to be footage of an actual ballistics test. They do this several times with the microscope at different points in the film, and it's very satisfying. Really, this film is like animation ASMR to me.
You can't spell Professor Rattigan without ASMR. Not only do I think they do the microscope sequences really well, I just like how much detectiving there is in this film. Basil's constantly getting his magnifying glass out and checking for things. He's constantly having to work stuff out. He's looking at clues. He's reading people's behaviour. For a film that's like an hour and 15 minutes long, there's a lot of detective work that goes on in it.
Yeah, we've got another really solid mystery narrative here. So Rattigan has taken Flaversham, and we don't really know why he wants a toy maker. I mean, it doesn't take much detective work as the audience to piece together what he's planning, but also his plan is so ridiculous that there's a few leaps you have to make there. But yeah, we as the audience get to see this plan unfold, and I think it's a really good narrative.
And speaking of why Rattigan's taken Flaversham, Olivia says that he is the best toy maker in London, which you kind of assume is she's saying that because it's her dad and he makes toys for her. But actually, I think the implication is that he is the best toy maker because we see him working on a kind of weird clockwork model of something that pours tea. And this is when we finally get introduced to the man himself, / the rat himself, Professor Rattigan.
I do enjoy that the first glimpse of his plan is a tea-making robot. I need my tea, damn it!
So how would you describe Professor Rattigan, Liam, for someone who's never seen this film?
Rattigan, to me, is kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing, who all the sheep know he's a wolf, but they're all too afraid to tell him. So they just go along with it and like, yep, you're a sheep.
So obviously a big part of his character is that he is a rat, but he is insistent that he is a mouse. And he's many times bigger than all the mice in this film, and he's drawn in a different artistic style to emphasise this. But you're absolutely right, there's this constant seething rage just underneath this veneer of respectability. And what I really like about this is seeded throughout the film. Every scene we see Rattigan in, we see how he's just struggling to push back those brutal animalistic instincts. In this scene, for instance, when he's threatening Flaversham, he mentions about his daughter Olivia when Flaversham's not complying with what he wants, and he picks up the toy Flaversham made for her birthday and just crushes it with one hand whilst smiling maniacally, and then it's done and he's back to being normal and polite in camp.
I love the use of clockwork around Rattigan as well, because it gives you that impression of a tightly coiled spring, that there is clockwork and gears and it's jarring and it's just about to break. It's always just there under the surface that this monster of a rat will just snap at any moment. But despite that, he consistently puts on this air of sheer campness.
You've put it into words, something that I've never been quite able to express, but yeah, the motif of clockwork and metal and springs and inevitability is something that links to Rattigan, both in terms of his personality, but there's constantly clockwork present, and we'll come to that towards the end of the film. After threatening Flaversham then, Rattigan goes back to hanging out with his cronies and leads us into one of only a couple of musical numbers in this film, but boy is it a good one.
Ratigan may be one of my favourite villain songs. It's far from the best, but it's definitely one of my favourites.
I'll be honest, Liam, my only note for this scene pretty much is Ratigan, need I say more? And I was like, yes, I do need to say more. This is a podcast. Just very briefly before we talk about The World's Greatest Criminal Minds, the song they sing, this is the scene that has Bill the Newt from Alice in Wonderland in, and I don't know why.
In previous podcasts, we've touched briefly on the concept of diegesis, the idea of whether something's happening within the film or on a more metaphorical level or for the benefit of the audience. And often in musicals, it's assumed that the songs are non-diegetic, that they're a metaphor for the emotion that the character can't express in words. I would wager that all of the songs in this film happen in the reality of the film, and that Ratigan forces his henchmen to sing a song about him because it fits, and all of the other songs definitely happen in the narrative. So it makes sense that this one also would. And the song is interrupted at a moment, suggesting that it is happening.
Yeah, it's interrupted when one of the henchmen, Bartholomew, as Ratigan calls him, accidentally refers to him as being a rat, and initially he's furious and kicks him out of the den, but then again that veneer comes back and he just gently rings his little bell he carries in his pocket and summons Felicia, the big fat cat that eats his enemies.
And again, it's done really well. It's done off screen, but we can hear Bartholomew singing to himself, and then the singing just stops.
There's a surprising amount of death in this film. It's all implied or off screen, but yeah, a lot of characters definitely die. Also, what I love is this isn't really a musical. As we've said, there's 3 songs in it. But for a film that's about Basil and his adventures, there's 3 songs in it, and 2 of them are sung by Ratigan, and 1 of them sung by a completely unrelated character. The main characters have no songs.
Because it's just not part of their personality. Again, the songs are happening in real life, therefore only characters who would want to sing actually do.
And what's really interesting is Vincent Price, who absolutely nails this performance as Ratigan, if that's not clear, he said it was one of his favourite roles because he got a chance to sing. And when he signed up and was cast in the role, it kind of changed the way they were going with Ratigan. I think before it was more sort of conniving, snivelly, little Weasley type character. And this is way more interesting than that sort of stereotypical rat type bad guy. Maybe in the animal kingdom and the perceptions we have of rats in an anthropomorphic sense, that's how we see them. But in the world of mice, rats are these big hulking brutes.
One detail I really love from this song is that it seems that Ratigan stole the actual crown jewels.
If we're talking about details in this song, Liam, what about the line, "Worse than the widows and orphans you drowned"? That's a line that just slips under the radar there of, just so we're clear, Ratigan has killed dozens of children. My only other note on this scene is I think we start to see some of the use of colour we get in The Little Mermaid in this sequence, where you get these almost colour filters and these changes in what would normally be the lighting of the scene to reflect the sort of emotion and tone of it. Again, I think that's something previous films really missed and weren't using in that way. It's very different to when we talked about in the Aristocats, where they have those sort of palette swaps, because it's very clear they've changed the way those characters are coloured in, whereas this is more gradual and more reflective of their mood. And yeah, it's not realistic, as it were. You know, that's not lighting that's happening in the world of the film, but also I think it is really expressive. And again, we're in animation, we're in a visual medium. This is how you should be using colour.
You know, I never really thought about that before, but you're right. As Ratigan goes into his harp solo, because of course he has a harp solo. After the song, we start getting a bit more of an insight into what his plan might be. It involves something to do with the Queen's Jubilee. Again, this is the Mouse Queen's Jubilee, and somehow he's going to use this to his advantage to become the ruler of all mousedom.
I think if Ratigan was more ambitious, he should have gone for the human queen and tried to rule over the human kingdom instead. That's way more impressive.
He did steal the actual human crown jewels. Are you suggesting, then, that Moriarty should be more focused on the Rat Kingdom and trying to rule that? I think that would be a good way to evade both Basil and Sherlock, is if suddenly they just swap the domains they're operating in.
I feel Ratigan's definitely getting the better deal there. This is Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime, and it's just a man writhing in rats.
Yeah, but Sherlock would leave him alone then.
Everyone would.
He's got his rats and his rat crown jewels. He's perfectly fine. Speaking of Sherlock, actually, we get a bit of a crossover in our next scene where Basil and Watson realise they're going to need help tracking down Fidget. So they go to meet Sherlock's friend, his colleague Toby, and I really like this crossover.
So what they do is they play a clip of Basil Rathbone as Sherlock talking to Laurie Main as Dr. Watson, and this is taken from 1966 film of Sherlock Holmes, and obviously Basil Rathbone is where Basil the Great Mouse Detective takes his name from, so it's a little bit meta. And also I suppose it's the second time we actually get Basil Rathbone's voice in a Disney film, because he did narrate The Wind in the Willows.
The Toby they're going to meet is Toby the Bloodhound from the Sherlock Holmes stories, which Basil claims that he trained Toby, which confuses me. He seems to have some control over him, but again, I've just got so many questions about how this world interacts if Toby does double shifts working for both Sherlock and Basil.
The simple explanation is that Basil's sort of self-aggrandizing and it's really Sherlock who did the training. The more confusing explanation is that Sherlock bought an untrained dog, Basil trained it, and Sherlock just found out about that one day.
Honestly, I'm fine with either of those situations happening. I think they're both equally believable. I love the animation on Toby. I think he's a really good cartoon dog. He is a dog, I will say. He's not, an anthropomorphic dog. Again, I have so many questions. It's about the link between the mouse world and the human world, because mice are like mini people, or humans are like giant mice, but dogs are still dogs.
Well, it's more complicated than that, because dogs and cats are just dogs and cats, although they can talk to mice and rats. You get mice, rats, a newt, an octopus at one point. These all exist in a specific society. A bat, but dogs and cats, no, they don't.
So they enlist the help of Toby. They have Fidget's flat cap, and they've got the scent, so they can use it to track down Fidget. They ride on Toby, who leads them to a toy store. And again, one of those images that is just burnt into the deepest recesses of my mind is Basil, Dawson, and Olivia on the windowsill of the toy store, and they see a circular piece of glass, and it's got a tiny little hole in it, and Basil suggests that this is how Fidget got in. And it's just this wonderful image that's always stuck with me.
It's a really fun little visual. Simply all Basil does when Dawson questions is he sticks Dawson's finger in it in the window, and Dawson pulls it back and it opens up the little glass panel. And again, you know how I feel about show don't tell, right? They could have just had them track it down and they go inside, but yeah, it's another nice little bit of puzzle solving and detective work.
And on the other side of the glass is a toy shop full of clockwork toys. It's very Christmassy. I think it's really appropriate for this time of year, actually.
You see, you say Christmassy, I think the scene is creepy.
Yeah, creepy Christmas.
I think we're obliged to mention one of the clockwork toys is Dumbo.
Oh yeah, we get a Dumbo cameo. Yeah, I do just have a point that clockwork toys, they're just creepy. Also, is Flaversham using toy-based clockwork? Because that little doll he made for Olivia is really intricate and must have used tiny mouse gears.
It's a good question, Liam, and I think I can best answer it by saying he controls a tea-pouring robot with 2 levers that go up or down.
So yeah, this scene is quite tense. It's quite unsettling. There's some mystery going on. Fidget is collecting uniforms and gears, and the girl, he's been given a list of things to collect, and they come to the toy shop and they see the guard toys without their uniforms. They see clockwork toys having their innards ripped out, and they just don't quite know what's going on. Meanwhile, Olivia wanders off and hears a tiny baby doll cooing, goes to investigate it, and we're treated to our second jump scare involving Fidget.
Yeah, he does exactly the same thing as last time. It's still scary.
He's a horrifying little bat. It's really scary.
And then we get a sequence where there's clockwork toys flying everywhere, and Basil and Dawson are trying to catch Fidget and save Olivia, and basically they fail at that.
Entirely due to Dawson as well. It was his job to look after Olivia.
Yeah, and Basil just has a go at him because Basil is an arsehole. I love Basil as a character, by the way. I mean, he's got the arrogance and the sort of general lack of person skills that Sherlock Holmes has, and Dawson responds by just being very sad.
I will at this point say the film is incredibly pacey. We've only just hit the 30-minute mark, and this feels like something that would be happening around the end of the second act, but there's still a lot of film to go.
Yeah, I think we both discussed this outside of the podcast, that at different points we just stopped making notes because we just ended up watching it and got drawn in. It's really pacey, it's really entertaining. Every scene serves a function, but also it doesn't outstay its welcome. The structure of it's really solid.
But all hope is not lost. Dawson has picked up the note that Fidget has misplaced, which is going to provide them with a clue. So it's back to Baker Street to see if they can track down where Fidget has gone off to.
We do get a very brief cut back to Ratigan and Fidget returning all the items. Ratigan discovers Fidget has left the list behind and that Basil saw him. Ratigan initially, he's about to lose his cool, but then he takes Fidget under his arm, walks him round, and obviously immediately tries to feed him to the cat.
I will add, the only reason they find out that Fidget has lost the list is he goes looking for it in the pocket built into his wing, which is horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose Fidget is a mess of a character anyway. He's missing a leg, and it said he's got a broken wing a few times, although I swear, every time I watch this film, I can't work out which one's meant to be broken, but fine.
Yeah, overall, it's just a nice little scene, again, just building that character of Ratigan as someone who is constantly on the edge of showing how unhinged he really is.
But Ratigan, being a criminal mastermind, the world's greatest criminal mind, in fact, sees this as an opportunity to deal with Basil once and for all. And with that, we cut back to Basil and Dawson.
This scene is really satisfying. I think if you're a kid and you're watching this, it makes you excited about the potential of being a detective, whereas in reality, being a detective is often just paperwork and interviews and tracking down horrible, horrible leads.
So there you go, kids. Live the dream.
In animation, however, being a detective is chemistry and it's experiments and it's science, and every time I use a pestle and mortar in real life, it makes me think of this scene.
Yeah, so Basil does the classic Sherlock Holmes thing of ascertaining all sorts of information just from a piece of paper, and he works out they need to go to a very specific pub where the sewer meets the river and feeds into the sea. I'm going to say, even if you're a mouse, I wouldn't want to go to a pub by a sewer.
The thing that stood out to me is that he says there's only one place where the sewer meets the waterfront, which made me realise these writers have never been to London.
There's only one place, but it's a mile wide.
So yeah, they go to this horrible little dive pub on the waterfront. They go in disguise, dressed as pirates and sailors. I've got to admit, Basil in his disguise looks great.
Yeah, he has a little moustache. He looks very suave.
Dawson, on the other hand, isn't obviously very accustomed to this, and he doesn't really know how to fit in, so he just has to try and copy Basil.
Dawson reminds me of me when I was 18, and I was going out drinking for the first time, and I didn't know how anything worked, but I wanted to appear cool, and that I did. So I was like, I'll just copy whatever this cooler guy I'm with does, and hope no one finds me out to be the shill I am.
Only to drink a spiked drink and start a bar fight.
Ah, those were the days.
I like the bar scene. I won't go as far as saying I love it. Every time I watch it, I spend far too much time looking at the cardboard cutouts of mice in the background.
What?
Every character in the background of this scene is completely still. They're all monocolour as well. They're just block filled, and it just feels as if they're in a pub full of cardboard cutouts, but someone has taken the liberty of putting lit cigars into the mouths of all these cutouts.
Maybe that's a business decision, because as we know, you never go in like a pub or a restaurant that's completely empty, because then you go, well, the locals obviously know this is one to avoid, so you don't go in. So I suppose if you have cardboard cutouts that look like they're smoking, you can trick people into coming in and getting actual customers.
But no, they order 2 pints. Meanwhile, the bar is quite rowdy because they don't enjoy the juggling octopus or the unicycling newts.
That's the best description I've got, yeah. I'd be impressed that an octopus is breathing on land, to be honest.
How many pubs have you gone to where the entertainment is a juggler?
I don't think I've been to a pub that has entertainment.
That's a very good point.
Bring on the pub quiz machine.
Though it's not all octopuses and newts, we are treated to a rather fetching mouse singing a song. I think the only reason this song is in the film is because Vincent Price wanted to sing a song, but they hadn't wrote a musical. So they're like, it can't just be Vincent Price singing 2 songs.
I don't like quoting Wikipedia, but the way they've worded this is superb. So Jeffrey Katzenberg wanted a more modern style song than what they originally wrote, which is like a Victorian music hall type song. And Michael Eisner was there as well. And we're going to read this as a quote. Michael Jackson was considered by Eisner to voice a character who would enter the saloon, confront Basil and sing a song at the tavern, but the suggestion was met with uncomfortable silence, for which Eisner withdrew the idea. I'm picturing minutes go by and he goes, what about Michael Jackson? And then they all just like stare at their notes or look like they're thinking about it. And then eventually goes, or not. And they go, yeah, let's go with or not.
Yeah, let's not. I think it's a good song. I think it doesn't serve much purpose. It's just kind of awkwardly there. It's a bit sexy.
It's very sexualized. The song's called Let Me Be Good to You, and it's about a stripping mouse singing very unsubtly implied sexual favours.
Not just a stripping mouse, 3 stripping mice.
They've clearly bought into the Miss Bianca school of thought where white mice are objectively the sexiest mice.
It's bizarre, but it's met with a round of applause, at which point Basil and Dawson's drinks have arrived. Basil is quick to deduce that the drinks have been spiked because earlier he asked for his old friend who goes by the name Ratigan, so suggesting that maybe something's going on and he's purposely invited the danger. Dawson, quick to just have a drink, downs it, it's spiked, goes into a bit of a drunken bothering, I would say. He just starts bothering people.
Yeah, I don't know what they spiked Dawson's drink with, but in the space of about 5 minutes, he goes from sober to incredibly drunk, to dancing wildly, to drunkenly falling over and starting a fight, to being fine again.
Do you think the animators spent time studying the effect of LSD on mice? Those old studies. They just brought cages of mice in, drugged them with various things. They're fine in 5 minutes, let's just do that.
Maybe they were all teetotalers whose only experience of alcohol was from Dumbo.
So yeah, there's a brawl. In the chaos, Basil notices that Fidget has been there and has left, so they're quick in pursuit. They see him entering a sewage pipe and they follow him all the way back to Ratigan's, I say secret lair, it's a giant barrel with a big ornate R on it.
And they stealthily sneak up to it to try and rescue Olivia, who's been imprisoned in a bottle, and she's curled up there, but once again, it's Fidget.
Generally, as a good rule for this film, if Fidget's on screen, expect the jump scare within the next 5 minutes.
No, if Fidget's not on screen.
No, he's always shown first in some way. It's really weird. They show him briefly and then they use him for a jump scare. It's so weird.
Ratigan has prepared a big, ironic surprise party celebrating that Basil's found him, but of course he was expecting it, and him and his henchmen all laugh at Basil. First few times I watched this, I was like, this seems just a bit weird, like, they're just going to laugh at him. But I think it's very much about, up to this point, Basil's been defined by his ego, so he's only really interested in solving this case because he wants to beat Ratigan, not because he wants to help Olivia. So I think having his ego sort of broken down at this point changes the way he approaches the problem.
I love their relationship in this moment. It's very camp from Ratigan. This isn't a small undertaking. He had a huge banner, there is confetti, there's champagne, everything just explodes into a big party. Like, that took hours of preparation.
Ratigan's priorities are very weird because we establish he only kidnaps Flavisham the day before he needs the robot building.
Unless Olivia was living in that shoe for months.
Just one little Ratigan moment I really love in this is Ratigan taunts Basil by saying he was 15 minutes later than he expected him to be, and Basil retorts by calling him a rat, and we cut back to Ratigan who's got his stopwatch open smiling, and there's no response for a few seconds and he just snaps it shut, and you can tell that fury is there, but he's just managing to contain it. It's just a really nice little mannerism.
And so Basil's been outsmarted by Ratigan, and not one to overdo it, Ratigan decides he's finally going to kill Basil after years of presumed rivalry, and his method of execution might be my favourite Rube Goldberg machine in anything.
Oh, it's so good. So what he's got is he's got a record player with a song he's specially written and performed for Basil. So it's a record of Ratigan singing. When the needle gets to the centre of the record, it sets off a chain of things which basically leads to a mousetrap crushing them, then a hammer cutting them, a crossbow shooting them, a gun shooting them, and an anvil falling on them, and then a photograph being taken.
This is one of those scenes where they get the scale right, because everything in this scene is from the human world, including the record and record player, suggesting Ratigan went into a human recording studio to produce this record. They have a human gun, a human anvil. It's absolutely ridiculous. And again, the song is real. He recorded it. He describes it as a sprightly tune. He recorded it especially for Basil. Again, he's put so much time into this.
Let's just be clear, he's a criminal mastermind who is personally overseeing the recording of a song to taunt his enemy, and he's sent Fidget out to do all the actual important stuff for his scheme.
So the song plays and Basil admits defeat as Ratigan flies away in his dirigible.
Yeah, he flies off to Buckingham Palace in his little airship, which again is perfect for him. It's big and it's bulky and it's sort of a bit gentlemanly but also a bit raw. The other thing I really like about this sequence is Ratigan never does the Bond villain thing. He never says, and you couldn't foil my plan. He's like, yep, I outsmarted you. I'm not going to tell you what my plan is. Bye.
They even actually managed to write in a kind of counter to the classic Bond villain criticism. He says, I would love to stay, but I've got a prior engagement. Like, he has to go. He specifically says if he had arrived on time, he had really hoped to watch this take place, but unfortunately Basil was 15 minutes late, and now Ratigan has to head off to Buckingham Palace.
So, at Buckingham Palace, we see Queen Moustoria getting ready for her Diamond Jubilee when Ratigan's henchmen show up and promptly replace her with a robot version of Queen Moustoria.
I feel if someone replaced Queen Victoria with a clockwork version of her, I feel someone would notice. Don't get me wrong, it's a really good replica. This is clearly made by the best toy maker in London, but it's still clearly a toy.
So basically what he does is he has the robot declare him as the royal consort and effectively make him the king to all intents and purposes. And presumably his plan is therefore shortly after for Queen Moustoria, the fake one, to die, because he's also killing off the real one, by the way. He's getting Fidget to throw her to the cat.
Yeah, all in all, I feel I like his plan. I think it's nice and camp, but I feel there was much easier ways to take control of Mousedom. I will give him this, though. The outfit he comes out in is absolutely fantastic.
Liam, you better believe that's one of the images we're using on the YouTube video. I don't care it's not of Basil. It's the best image in the film.
He just bursts through the curtain wearing this huge purple robe adorned with medals. I'm not sure where the medals are from. And a little crown, and he's just grinning. And everyone reacts so shocked that the Queen has just made Ratigan her royal vizier.
I was going to say it'd be like a major world leader putting a criminal in a really high, important position, and then I just sighed to myself and got very sad.
Meanwhile, back with Basil and Dawson, Basil's completely given up. He realises he's finally been outsmarted and is accepting death.
But Dawson again appealing to his heart and saying, we've got to rescue Olivia, if we don't, who will? Eventually triggers something in Basil, and he comes up with a very convoluted scheme to save them, where basically they trigger the mousetrap at just the right time to stop the ball triggering it, which gives them enough room to escape, and all the devices fire off in different directions, free them all, and they pose for a photo before running off to Buckingham Palace.
I love this scene because it shows that Basil is basically as unhinged as Ratigan himself.
Yeah, that's fair.
He's completely manic.
He's just laughing to himself, talking about setting off a trap that will kill them. And Dawson's like, are you sure?
But they're now free, so they have to save the day. They enlist the help of Toby, they run to Buckingham Palace and barge in to stop Ratigan in his plan. We interrupt a really good moment. Ratigan's first act, he just unveils this huge list of changes he would like to implement, and I do wish we saw more of the changes, because the only one we get to hear is number 97, which is impose a heavy tax on parasites, including the elderly, the infirm, and especially children.
It's so good. Why? How does it benefit him? I love it. It's so good.
The one that we saw is perfect, but I would have loved to just have heard so many of his weird plans that are just unnecessary and bitter.
But Toby chases off Felicia. She eventually climbs up to a wall and jumps into where the guard dogs are. I'm just going to say it, she's definitely torn to pieces and eaten. Dawson and Basil take care of Fidget and the other henchmen, and Basil sabotages the robot, denounces Ratigan, and bursts out calling him a rat in front of absolutely everyone, which is the worst thing you can do to Ratigan.
I really like the turn in this scene because we see it through the actions of the Clockwork Queen, where she just starts insulting Ratigan and denouncing him, and then he realises that something has happened, at which point we cut to behind the scenes where Basil is now controlling the two sticks and talking into the gramophone. And it's just this nice moment where all the crowd are terrified of Ratigan and it just allows them to turn against him. And then it's that final moment where Basil bursts through and suddenly the Queen comes along as well and orders the guards to arrest Ratigan, but he flees, taking Olivia with him, actually.
Yeah, he's surprisingly nimble for a massive fat rat stuffed into a suit. Ratigan and Fidget manage to escape, again taking Olivia as captive, as you say, and they go back to his little dirigible thing to fly away. Ratigan threatening that if Basil follows him, he will kill Olivia.
But Basil, not liking children anyway, runs after them. He's in hot pursuit. They manage to commandeer some balloons that are being used for the actual Queen's Jubilee.
Whoa, you don't know they're not there for the Mouse Queen Jubilee. You just made an assumption there.
I'd love to see the mice putting those up, trying to tie them down one at a time. It'd be like the Macy's Thanksgiving parade with just hundreds of people per balloon. So they give chase, and I think the chase looks a little bit silly, the way the two balloons are moving throughout the rooftops of London. Again, I wonder if people saw this, what they'd think.
What would people think if they saw a rat and a bat peddling a dirigible whilst three mice flying a Union flag held up by balloons across Tower Bridge? You wonder how people would react to that image. At best, confusion.
I'd say at best they'd go, oh, I've got an idea for a children's book.
That rat's very well dressed. Partway along the way, Fidget gets tired of peddling and suggests they lose some of the baggage on board. Ratigan, you can see it coming a mile off, he says, "What an excellent idea," and throws Fidget to his death.
I do love it as a trope, but you've got to wonder why these minions don't see it coming. They're always walking into these. This I love, where Ratigan takes over and starts pedaling, and he is fast. Like, again, he is a brute of a rat compared to all of these mice. And it is really animalistic as we reach the climax of the film. But giving chase, they end up crashing into the Tower of Westminster, through and into the room housing Big Ben, which leads us to one of my favourite finales for a very long time.
I think this sequence is superbly done. When they crash, we kind of get a cut to black, and then we fade up of Basil regaining consciousness, and we get this huge, ominous panning shot of all the clockwork, and it's superbly animated. I'd say it's one of the technically most impressive scenes we've had up to this point, arguably ever in Disney. I think it's incredibly well done. It's not a bright, dynamic scene. It's not the finale of Hunchback of Notre Dame or Moana or whatever. There's a Moana reference. But I think it perfectly encapsulates what this film's trying to do. And this is, as we said, we've got this motif of clockwork and Ratigan, and this feeds into it perfectly.
So the setting of the scene is all of the giant cogs that control the clock and Big Ben, and the way they're able to make it so cinematic is they end up using 3D animation for really the first time. I know there's bits of computer animation in The Black Cauldron, but this is the first time they're using full 3D modeling, and I love 2D animation, but you can be so much more cinematic when you have a 3D environment to play with. But obviously this is very early days. They knew their limitations. They could only really do basic polygons, and that's all they did, just these block coloured polygonal cogs all interacting, and it created this 3D space that they could move around, and it's absolutely fantastic.
And it's a shame they didn't learn this lesson for some of their later work, but they've identified what they can and can't do well with computer animation, and yeah, they're using it for something that works well. We get a bit of a confrontation between Basil and Ratigan. Olivia ends up trapped in cogs that are coming to crush her. Ratigan obviously physically completely surpasses Basil, but Basil, using his quick wits, stuffs Ratigan's cape in a cog so he gets caught and choked, and Basil rides a chain up, freeing Olivia and starting to flee from the clock tower.
One thing I love about this sequence is as Ratigan gets his cloak caught, he rips it off, and that veneer of presentability and civility, it's physically gone at this point. His clothes are completely tattered, and I think he starts moving about on all fours as well. He just becomes very animalistic and feral, and it's just a complete change, showing how he's just hit the end of his patience, and all attempts to hide his true nature, it's gone. And he's now just pure rage focused on killing Basil, and it's terrifying.
It really is, and one of the things I noticed this time round is he has his huge claws he comes out, and so he chases Basil onto the face of the clock tower, and Basil manages to throw Olivia to the safety of the balloon with Dawson and Flavisham, and Ratigan's just tearing Basil to pieces with his claws, and I realised that the rest of the film he's always wearing gloves, presumably to disguise this, and again with the cloak torn off his back, his long rat-like tails coming out. I think it's incredibly well done.
And they end up brawling on the hands of the clock tower.
Now you say brawling, I'd say Ratigan is beating the shit out of Basil.
Yeah, this is Shere Khan before the fire. It's completely one-sided at this point. But Basil, he's never going to beat him physically, but mentally he always has the upper hand, and he manages to distract Ratigan at just the right moment as the clock is about to strike 10. In the ensuing brawl, he had stolen Ratigan's little bell, rings it, distracting Ratigan as he looks for it, at which point the clock strikes 10. The huge bong rings out, causing Ratigan to lose his footing and sending him falling to his death.
In a nice callback to the final problem, the confrontation between Moriarty and Sherlock in the books, where they both tumble over, Reichenbach falls. Ratigan grabs Basil on his way down and takes him with him, seemingly killing them both. But then we hear a little squeaking noise, and Basil's managed to grab on his way down the tiny little cycling mechanism from Ratigan's dirigible and manages to fly back up to the balloon and to safety.
It's a really nice climax to the film. I think it's quite scary. I think it's really tense. It's incredibly cinematic. I'd argue it's probably the most cinematic climax we've had since Sleeping Beauty.
What, more cinematic than a woman driving a car off a road? Or an old skull-headed guy falling into a cauldron? You saying it's more cinematic than those?
And even more cinematic than a butler falling into a trunk to Timbuktu. It tops all of them.
And then we get our classic end of film return to normality sequence. Olivia and Flavisham are going on a train somewhere. Don't know where, I thought they lived in London, but fine. We get the culmination of a joke that doesn't really ever work, where no one can ever remember Flavisham's surname and keeps saying it wrong. I just said it wrong then, I said Flavisham, because that's how forgettable it is.
Yeah, it's a strange joke. It's specifically Basil, and I think it's supposed to show that he doesn't particularly care for children and that he's not paying much attention to this young girl. And I think the final joke is that he seems to sincerely put effort into getting the name right and still gets it wrong, at which point Dawson finally concedes and says what has been Basil's catchphrase through the film, which is just whatever. Which is a weird catchphrase for a Sherlock Holmes character.
There is a weird tension in this final sequence where Dawson's like, well, I best be going, and Basil's like, oh, do you have to? And I was like, if there's a moment where you ship these characters, this is it, because they really seem quite into each other.
I would say the weird tension mostly arises from the fact that Basil kept the bell as a gruesome trophy.
Where'd you get that from? Oh, I killed a man.
Pride of place on the mantelpiece just underneath the portrait.
But as Dawson is leaving, he opens the door and finds a tearful young mouse saying she's in dreadful trouble. Dawson introduces her to Basil of Baker Street, and Basil introduces Dawson as his loyal companion for solving any cases. And we quickly launch into Basil doing his standard Sherlock Holmes, deducing someone just by their appearance. We see Toby listening in on outside. Dawson narrates over the top that that was his first adventure with Basil of Baker Street, and the film ends.
I really like the ending, and I think it's perfectly self-contained, but I also would have liked to have seen more from these characters, not necessarily in feature film, but I definitely think there's more Disney could do with them.
I think the only real downside is, where do you go after Ratigan? He's Moriarty, so in terms of Sherlock Holmes stories, who's going to be a bigger threat? But also, he's such a good character. If you took him out of that, would it be as interesting? Could another villain be as entertaining? I don't know.
Do what the Disney TV shows tended to do and just do a prequel set in their high school years.
The only other note I have on this film, and this is right at the end, so I don't think I've noticed this before, because normally like the end credits start rolling and the score rolls, and I was like, okay, and normally I just switch it off, but I was like, well, I'm doing it for the podcast. About halfway through the credits, after you get a roll of the main title theme, you get this weird 1950s choral version of Isn't It a Crime, which is the song Rattigan records for Basil, and I was like, this is a weird choice.
Well, what were their other options? World's Greatest Criminal Mind or getting a choir to sing the sexy song in the middle?
Well, Clements and Musker come up with what I think is the best solution in a couple of years' time, but we'll get to that. Before we give our final thoughts on Basil the Great Mouse Detective, Liam, is there anything else we need to talk about?
There's just one thing we need to decide before we can go any further. And I think this is going to be a fairly straightforward one where I think we're going to be in quite clear agreement. So, Ben, who is the sexiest character in The Great Mouse Detective? And why is it Basil?
I knew you were going to do this, Liam. I mean, it's obviously not. It's obviously the sexy cabaret mouse in the bar.
I know we're supposed to talk about objective sexualization of animated characters.
Just to be clear, Liam, you say we're meant to. We made this stupid feature up and defined the rules of it. No one's policing this other than us.
There's just something about Basil, particularly with his little mustache in his disguise. It sticks with me and I'm like, that is a sexy mouse.
I think Basil's perpetually ruined for me by, I'll try and find a clip of it somewhere, but on the DVD menu of this film, they've got a really crap drawing of Basil, and because like this isn't like a really big hitter, all it is the only animation is his eyes wildly circling in his head while he smiles a manic grin, and it's kind of taken any sexiness out of the character for me.
But no, I think I'm happy to concede that that is a weirdly and inappropriately sexy mouse in the middle of this film, singing a sexy song, and apparently all at the request of Jeffrey Katzenberg, so...
So what are your final thoughts on Basil the Great Mouse Detective?
It's not without its problems. As I say, I think the scaling in this film is often very lazy, and the fact that we've seen something so good in something like The Rescuers, and even then I said it wasn't really enough, and I want to see them constantly asking the question, how do these creatures live in a world inhabited by humans, and what does that look like? And here it just seems to be miniaturized versions of everything that humans have. And also there's bizarre question of how this society mirrors our own so perfectly, and I'm going to be honest, I think the source material is just lazy. I think that's the problem we have. As a film, its narrative arc is fantastic. Again, I don't think the mystery is too unsolvable. I actually think if a lot of people would watch it with their kids, they'd kind of get what Rattigan was up to pretty quickly. It's clearly something to do with the Queen, but there's enough there that it is slowly revealed, and I think for young kids, that's going to be a nice introduction to mystery storytelling. On top of that, I think our lead characters are really strong. I think Rattigan, Basil, and Dawson are great, and that's all you really need to be great. So overall, I've got a real soft spot for this film. I think the stuff it does well, it does really, really well, and it doesn't really do anything badly.
Okay, so I'm going to try and quantify how I feel about this film and how I suspect a lot of people feel about this film. I put it in the category of films that were released by Disney that are good films that don't feel like Disney films. So I'd also put in with that Big Hero 6 and also Atlantis: The Lost Empire. Second might be a bit more controversial, but we'll come to those two films. All three of these films are ones where I watch them and think they're very solid. I think they're very entertaining, but they lack a lot of the key Disney elements, so there's not really any magic. There is some music granted in this film, although it's not exactly a full-blown musical. There's no romance. A lot of those key Disney elements aren't really there. So I guess the question is a film that is incredibly entertaining, very well paced, very well animated, great characters, interesting plot, overall a fairly complete package, but doesn't feel like a Disney film? Is a film like that worthy of going on the list? Because I think in terms of quality, as a film enough itself, absolutely it's as good as Robin Hood and a lot of the other films we put on there. I went to Robin Hood because, again, for me that's an example of a flawed film that I think its strengths and its charm carry it over. So I guess I bounce that question across to you, Liam. Does a Disney film that doesn't feel like a Disney film but is great deserve the honour?
I'll counter that by reminding you that, somewhat controversially, we put The Rescuers on for being a completely unique product within the animated classics for aiming to do something so different and achieving that to a certain degree. I would say that whilst different, I don't think The Great Mouse Detective was particularly aiming to do anything revolutionary. Interestingly, it came out the same year as An American Tail, and I wonder how much corporate espionage was going on behind where they're like, oh, we need a mouse film, let's find a mouse film and throw it out. But the end product, even if it doesn't feel like a traditional Disney film, it definitely feels like a Musker and Clements film, and it definitely has the strengths of their films.
Unfortunately, Liam, I think whilst you've convinced me that, yes, my vote goes to put Basil on the list, you've also convinced me that maybe I need to revise my appraisal of The Rescuers.
Well, you can't. We've put it on. And there's no going back. I think the fact that this film is so enjoyable in its own right is all that really matters. As I say, it's not particularly flawed. It's just very different. And what it aims to do is fairly simple, and I think it achieves it very well. Its characters are incredibly strong. There's not much substance here, but what is there is incredibly enjoyable. And I think for that, I want to put it on the list.
Well, in that case, it's a vote from both of us. So, Liam, please do the honours.
Is this one going on in mouse writing too?
This can go on big rat writing.
Big, scrawled, splotchy rat writing. I'll add a bit of coal and seawater as well, just for the added effect. And with that, The Great Mouse Detective has been added to the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. But of course, that is just our opinion. Do let us know what you think. I know this is often considered an overlooked and underrated classic, but is it as good as we're making it out to be? And more importantly, do you think Basil should have been the sexiest character?
And indeed, should The Rescuers retroactively come off the list? This is all important stuff we need to know. But if you're interested to know how The Rescuers and all the other classics made it onto the list, please do listen to the previous episodes of the podcast. And in the meantime, we're going to be going away and watching another film. Liam, what are we looking at next time?
Next time, Ben, we are looking at yet another one of my childhood favourites, 1988's Oliver and Company. A somewhat interesting adaptation of Oliver Twist.
Well, I feel this is a film we've both got a lot to say on, and maybe for different reasons.
That depends whether your reasons are entirely related to 45 minutes of discussion about Billy Joel.
Spoiler warning, they're not. So once again, thank you very much for listening, and this has been Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics.